Ladies and gentlemen, it is my delight and honor to have two mentors, friends, teachers, surrogate parents from time to time who spent their youth, were born in South Africa, spent their youth resisting, experiencing apartheid, and we would like today to get some of their experience on the record if we can. So, could we get a rough outline for the uninitiated of how apartheid came into being, the overall structure in the greatest zoomed out sense of the Boers and the English South Africans and the native population, and apartheid being put in 1949, if I'm correct, and then get into your personal experiences of it? South Africa being the rainbow nation.
Okay, I think, Adam, you have to see an overview of the history. You have to go back to the original settlement of the European settlers in the southern tip of Africa, which is the Cape.
Yes.
The Cape region. The Dutch settlers who came there, the settlement was really established because of the Dutch East Indies, right? To get access to the East Indies, Indonesia, Sumatra, Malaysia, that area.
They needed a stopping point and a refueling.
They needed a stopping point to deal with the long sea voyages that they were making around the coast. The Portuguese, of course, were the first to open up those trade routes, and they made relatively extensive explorations up the East African coast and over to India, but they didn't establish a settlement the way the Dutch did. The Dutch established a way station so that they could bring fresh meat and fresh vegetables and fruit to revictual the ships coming through. And Table Bay, of course, is the famous harbor there. It made a very protected natural harbor. It wasn't called the Cape of Storms for nothing. And if you know anything, if you look into the history, of course, many ships were wrecked along the southern African coast there.
Yeah.
Coming around, you hit the ocean currents and the convergence coming up from Antarctica and so forth. It's very turbulent.
Incredibly rich seas, incredibly
very rich seas for fishing and all of that.
Yeah.
Famous still for tourists to go and molest white sharks and so on, great whites.
There's a big upwelling on the western.
That's right, and it was a great fishing ground. Still is to some degree, although of course it's been heavily over.
The Benguela upwelling.
Correct.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was the original establishment, and of course the Europeans, you're talking 1600, 1652, the Europeans didn't really have any real intention of establishing a country per se. It was more just a convenient trading post and way station. But gradually, over the years, the settlement expanded. It was relatively successful. They discovered the climate was very conducive to European settlement.
Yeah.
It was comfortable as opposed to other parts of tropical Africa.
Yeah.
Mediterranean climate, actually. So the Dutch settled a bunch of French Huguenots there and established the wine.
I didn't know that.
The wine processing thing relatively early. That's why South Africa has such a rich winemaking tradition.
And also why there's so many French names.
And French names amongst the Boer.
Called French Hook.
Really?
In the Cape area.
So they would have fled Catholic France.
The Dutch gave them refuge.
No kidding.
And then had to park them somewhere. And what better than the colonists?
The
colonies to dump them.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
that was the idea.
Wine.
So you get names amongst the Afrikaans people of Dubois and Duplessis and
De Beers.
De Beers.
Really? That De Beers diamonds?
A whole bunch. Can you think of some?
Leroux.
Leroux. Yeah, they're all common Afrikaner names. Yeah.
There
So
you go.
they assimilated to the Dutch population.
Okay.
Another thing people don't know is that a lot of this was all done under the auspices of the Dutch East India Company,
Right.
which was, of course, a precursor to the British East India
Sure.
Company.
Yeah.
And a lot of German mercenaries and a lot of Flemish peasants were signed up to work for the Dutch East India Company. So they weren't actually, strictly speaking, Dutch. They spoke Flemish,
Okay.
and many of them spoke German,
Okay.
and they were given grants of land in the South Africa, in the Cape Colony, when they'd finished their term of service with the Dutch East India Company. So
Okay.
gradually this whole rather motley population spread further and further inland. And
Okay.
as they did that, of course, they became like American. It's very easy for Americans, I think, who know their history to form parallels with South African history, and that helps them a lot, or it should help
Yeah.
them to understand the whole trajectory of how South Africa's history evolved.
Frontier zones.
Sure, absolutely. The further away they got from Cape Town, as it became, the more they felt themselves to be independent of the control of the Dutch authorities at the Cape. And they became more and more fractious and rebellious and independent-minded, right?
Yeah.
Why should they have to listen to an official telling them what to do, who was like literally 1,000 or
Oh, geez.
1,500 miles away, relatively remote to their life?
Yeah.
So gradually they developed an independent
Right.
identity.
Right.
But the other population that you haven't mentioned is the fact that because the Dutch were going to the east, they were going to Indonesia, any troublemakers that they had in their colony in Indonesia, they
Oh.
put onto the ships.
Sent them back.
And the punishment was to bring them and dump them at the foot of Africa. So that's where
Yeah.
what they call a Cape Malay population. In the Cape comes
Okay.
from. It's the so-called coloured population.
Okay.
Or the
that's-
roots of it.
or the roots of it, yes.
Mm.
So there's a whole Malay quarter today. If you go to Cape Town, you'll go on a little tourist visit,
Sure.
and they take you to the Malay, and that's also how Islam
Sure.
gets
Makes sense.
Took root in South
took root
Africa,
in South
yeah.
Africa.
So it's
And
very
they
much
were
a land.
technically slaves, those
Yeah,
people,
they were
at least at
enslaved.
the beginning.
Yeah,
So even though it's at the end of the earth, kind of, it's a crossroads. It's
Right.
very much a crossroads.
Hugely,
Right.
Yeah.
the famous phrase, of course, the Tavern of the Seas, right?
Oh,
Cape Town was
Oh.
called the Tavern of the Seas. The theory being that practically every ship in the world at some point called in there, one way
Yeah.
or the other.
Fair enough. Which really seems to contrast from the. I mean, nothing like this is happening at the Straits of Magellan.
Oh God, no, no,
You know,
no.
it's-
There's no comparison.
Yeah, it's just not there at
no,
all.
no. And the key, of course, is the Indies.
Yeah.
This huge allure for Europeans
Yeah.
that the
Jeez.
Indies had for 400 years or so. You know,
Yeah.
this was the huge. We were always told at school it was spices, but it was more than just spices. I mean, there were all these riches to be gleaned
Yeah.
and gained, and
Jeez.
colonies to be won and lost, and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But of course, on the indigenous populations, very quickly the Europeans were destructive in one form or another.
Right.
First of all, the native Hottentots who actually resided at the Cape were also enslaved to some degree and also wiped out. They
Yeah.
started out as friendly traders. It's a familiar story.
Yeah.
Yeah, they produced the cattle, for example, to revictual the ships. But after a while, they became kind of a nuisance as the colony grew and expanded.
Yeah.
And also, I think, succumbed to smallpox, right?
yes.
Yeah.
And various other European introduced
And you can see the
diseases as well.
parallel there with the Native Americans, you know.
Right.
Yes.
But an even small, like a very much small
Small,
population, right?
They were
Well, of the-
relatively small numbers.
Of the Bushman Hottentot
Yeah.
group, yes. But they were then further up as the Europeans moved up
Right.
the up the coast. They started to encounter the Africans.
Right. Bantu.
The so-called Bantu tribes,
Bantu
Right.
people.
Did the
Yes.
Hottentots get their cattle from the Bantu, not from the
Uh,
Europeans, or
They probably did, I
Oh,
would think. Yes,
think so.
They
it
used
was
to-
organic sort of process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
But the Bantu were coming in. The general theory is that they were migrating down. And
one of the
if you-
great human migrations, the
Right,
Bantu
Yes.
out of
from-
Nigeria.
from
West-
West
West.
Africa, sub-Sahara, but
Yeah.
yes. And of course they were mostly
Yeah,
cattle economy, right, people.
yeah,
And they were much more formidable proposition for the European settlers.
and much more numerous.
to deal
Yeah.
with. More
Farming.
numerous, more vigorous, more organized, militarily more powerful.
right. Exemplified by Shaka Zulu and
Oh,
Well,
later
because
on,
of
but
the
even
Xhosa people
even
first.
before, the Xhosa were
Yeah,
the
because
first group
they
that the
were
whites
first ones they
bumped
met.
into.
oh, so that
That's Mandela's people.
okay,
Or,
So you can think of it as
Eastern
this,
Cape, the eastern along so beyond Cape Town as
So-
you go up along the Eastern Cape. what's
okay,
today
and
now-
higher in elevation too, right? As you
Not so
is it-
much,
Oh.
more along the coast.
if you
Okay.
understand the geography, then the whole thing makes more sense.
okay,
Because basically it's a table plateau, southern Africa, right?
right,
And
Right.
along the coast, particularly on the eastern side, you've got the rainfall because it comes in off the Indian Ocean, which
Okay.
is warm.
right,
It rises as it hits the plateau.
Right.
It drops the precipitation.
right. Okay.
So
okay.
below the edge of the escarpment there is where you've got the most fertile lands. And that's
Okay.
where essentially that funneled the Bantu down
Okay.
the eastern coastal areas. And that became the contested prime land because
Okay.
it was the most fertile.
Right.
So Natal today, the Transkei, Eastern Cape, as Barbara said,
Okay.
that's the area where you fought for it because
Right.
it was prime. You could water your cattle, you could grow farms here. So
Okay.
the Whiteys essentially hit. Did it sting you?
We have an ant problem. Ant on the ankle.
The Whiteys hit almost a brick wall when they bumped into the Bantu tribes coming
Okay.
down on the northeastern side.
And
Round about the Fish River or the Kai River, we were always told that was where, history happened, kind of thing,
right.
because
And
then
significant.
they had to fight and contest with land and cattle, and there were numerous, both trading and skirmishes and interaction took place. Actually, quite complicated.
Oh, geez.
The actual history.
Oh,
But the broad upshot of it was the Bantu tribes had to be subdued for the whites to establish a country, to establish a
right.
permanent big
But
colony.
the Dutchmen actually, or the Afrikaners actually, they didn't clash that much. They clashed with them, but it was really after the British arrived
That pushed because that pushed the Dutch.
that pushed the Dutch further up,
Right.
so that there were more conflicts with the
A knock-on effect.
the Xhosa people.
Right.
And then come the 1820 settlers. So the British bring in a wave of British settlers whom they promised all kinds of land to and so on.
right.
And they place them between the
the Bantu
the
and the Dutch.
Bantus and the Dutch
as a buffer.
as a
Yes.
buffer.
As a buffer, basically.
I'm amazed they accepted that deal.
I
The
don't
settlers.
think they knew.
Oh,
They
didn't
were
know.
they were lured by promises of land.
Ah.
It was 1820. It was after the Napoleonic Wars.
Oh,
There
okay.
was a major economic recession
Okay.
in England, demobilized soldiers,
Right.
etc., from the wars, and it was an opportunity to start a new land. But all the way through South African history, the British, which includes, of course, Irish and
Course.
Scots and English
Yeah.
people, could never get enough Anglos to settle there.
Okay.
Naturally enough, they were scared of both the Bantu and the Dutch people. right?
Come settle in a war zone. They'll
Come
hate you
settle
on
in
every side.
in a war
Oh,
zone,
man.
and also wild animals,
Oh, God.
which these people knew
And the
absolutely
and the
nothing
disease.
about,
Yeah.
and various
Yeah.
possible ailments and diseases. Although, relatively speaking, of course, it was quite a benign
It's quite
climate.
Relative to
healthy-
other parts of
it's
Africa,
actually
for
a
sure.
healthy
oh God,
climate.
it's
yeah.
actually wasn't
But you
so
do
bad.
have some nasty snakes and things
Yeah,
like that.
Yeah.
that was enough to scare the bejesus out of a European
Yeah.
settler, pretty much.
A guy from a Napoleonic veteran looking at a
Yes.
rhinoceros.
Well, yes, it was odd. Anyway, and also a lot of the British settlers didn't know squat about farming.
Oh,
right?
Christ.
Never mind farming in Africa.
Yeah.
I mean, which is a whole different proposition
Yeah.
to farming in England.
Is it
Because
wet
it's
enough?
So much drier.
Yeah,
You have to
okay.
have a different type of sheep. You have to have a different kind of cattle. Otherwise, you're screwed. I mean,
Yeah.
you're not going to be able to farm. And they did bring merinos and they did bring Herefords and English. But
Right.
they normally had to be crossbred with the Afrikaner cattle that the Boers are already developed.
Ah,
Much more rangy and tough. They look
Right.
more like Texas Longhorns,
Yeah.
basically. And they're tough and they're able to cope. So there was, of course, intermingling took place relatively easily. You could say, and I used to say to my students, you can conceive of the white population of South Africa as a kind of Anglo-Dutch hybrid.
okay.
Because it really is pretty much, even though the two cultures were at odds for
Right.
a lot of the history of the country,
Right.
and we were brought up still to view Afrikaners with some suspicion and somewhat askance. And that was also partly because by the time I was growing up, 1950s, the Afrikaners in the white population had gained the ascendancy.
Right.
They had gained dominance.
Right.
And in order to understand that, you have to understand the decline of the British Empire
Right.
and the decline of British control over Southern Africa.
So when did Britain gain control of South Africa and ascendancy over the Dutch? Was it the Napoleonic Wars?
Yes, basically because what happened was Napoleon occupied Holland,
Right.
and he set up, I think it was his brother actually, a puppet
Batavian Republic or
a
something.
government.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
Batavia, of course, was in Indonesia.
Right.
So the Batavian Republic was the
Oh, I'm wrong.
independent Dutch entity, and they did govern the Cape for a while.
Oh,
And they were relatively friendly to the British,
okay.
but they were, of course, under threat from Napoleon and
Oh.
under threat. Their home country, if you like,
Right.
had been occupied by
Yeah.
Napoleon, by the French.
Yeah.
So and Britain looked at this situation. Before that, she'd been able to dock her ships going to India quite friendly. The Dutch,
Okay,
although
right.
there was rivalry,
Right.
the Dutch had primarily been a friendly nation. They'd allowed British ships to victual and resupply to
Right.
go the English East India Company. In
Right.
fact, there were a couple of British East India men famously wrecked off the Cape Coast, right?
Yeah.
There was the legend of the Grosvenor, remember?
Yeah, that's
It
right.
was a ship that was,
The
we were
Grosvenor.
brought up with that as
Little
like
song.
perhaps the treasure is still out there somewhere because this big East India men went down in a Cape Storm
Oh.
off the East Cape Coast, right? So they had been going through there, no real problem.
Right.
But they were keeping an eye on the situation because of Napoleon, because of geopolitics.
Right.
And
They
it
didn't
beca-
want the French to have it, basically.
No, well, because their lifeline to
Right.
India,
would be cut off.
they
Yeah.
pushed the French out of India, remember? And so they weren't
Yeah.
about to be,
And there's no Suez Canal at this point.
No.
So
absolutely not. So it's a strategic lifeline.
yeah.
So they go to the Cape, they temporarily seize it, then they relinquish it for a very brief period to the
Okay.
Batavian Republic again.
Okay.
And then they decided, wow, it was much better. We kind of like being there,
Yeah.
right?
It
So they
helps
es-
us sleep better at night.
Yes, they
Yeah.
establish a naval base, and essentially there's a token resistance by a small Dutch force, which doesn't amount to much,
Right.
and they take it over.
Okay.
So
So this is 1820s.
1815, actually before the end of the Napoleonic
Okay.
Crusade, or 1803, 1805,
Oh, okay.
somewhere around there.
Okay,
you
yeah.
know.
they're securing the British Empire is kind of securing a
Yeah.
loose
They're
thread.
also not
What they
really
reali-
interested in holding the southern tip of Africa. It's of no value to them except for this strategic route
Right.
to
Okay.
the Indies. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, what they realize is that they've now become masters over this uncontrollable, contentious
Well, quite quickly.
band of,
Yes.
of Dutchmen
Yes.
Right.
who are
Dutchmen, Germans, and Frenchmen.
yeah, who are fighting and who are
It's such a
fighting with
mess.
the Africans,
Yeah.
and so they figure they need to impress their values on
It's
the
a
place.
headache right from
They
Yeah.
need their own
Okay.
people, so that's one of the reasons that they bring
Yeah.
this whole. There's a big thing about whether your family comes from the 1820 settlers or not. you know,
Right. Oh, fair
in South
enough.
Africa.
amongst
So
the English-speaking people.
amongst the English-speaking
Yeah.
people.
It's sort
As
of
a-
like
as-
daughters
And
of
they,
the revolution.
and they didn't come in at the Cape. They came in at Port Elizabeth. Interestingly enough,
The
they-
names tell the story.
Yeah.
East London,
East London,
Port
Port,
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth. That's the east.
Yep. Doesn't it? Ah, it's
That's
all in
where
the names.
they came in, and that was just about the area where the Dutch were fighting with the Xhosa people, right?
Yeah.
So,
Okay. As opposed,
Grahamstown.
they were the people who came in the 1820s. They're the old money. They looked down on newer English speaking.
They weren't money.
in terms of South African history.
Right.
But in terms of coming from England, they were riffraff.
Yeah. They
Oh.
had,
Oh.
yeah,
okay,
they had.
okay.
They were. There
They
was.
came from all social classes.
Oh,
That's
interesting.
kind
Okay.
of why
Like
they
Australia.
left.
Ah.
Anyway.
Kind of the same.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But in South African culture, they became kind of, we
Right.
The daughters of the
resettled.
revolution. Or
Yeah,
if you
Yeah.
can
exactly.
trace your heritage to the Mayflower.
It
There you
flips.
go.
It
Same
flips.
thing.
Yeah.
Important
Yeah. Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, Australians are now proud if they had an actual criminal.
Oh,
you know,
right.
Right.
Like,
Convict
very
background.
proud.
Yeah, right.
No, they are. I mean, yeah.
Although a
No,
lot
I
of
know.
Australians didn't.
It's
of
like
course.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
It's like
Right.
black South Africans with a whole battle, against apartheid. You had to have had
Credentials.
jail.
Street,
Yeah. Yeah.
street
You-
cred.
if
Straight.
you-
Yeah.
Right, there
Yeah.
you go.
Straight up.
If you weren't, if you didn't have spend a spell in jail, you had no credentials at all. You were suspicious.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, one interesting aspect, the English settlers, of course, who was going to help them adapt to this whole new situation?
Yeah. The Dutch.
Was
yeah.
it going to be the British administration in Cape Town, again, pretty far away from where they were living,
Yeah.
or was it going to be the Dutch farmer next door? So actually you find collaboration as well as wariness and hostility,
Yeah.
but also realistically they do start assimilating and they do start migrating inland.
Yeah.
But what really sets the whole white settler thing off were a couple of things. One is the British wanted to establish an internal administration beyond the Cape
Okay.
Harbour and their immediate jurisdiction.
Right.
They wanted to also make sure that they had control, after a while, of the inland.
Okay. Okay.
And in order to do that, they had to bring these fractious Boers to heel.
Right.
What they didn't like about the Dutch farmers was that they made a habit of whipping their servants and their slaves.
Ah. Yeah.
And also, 1830 comes round, 1833, the emancipation of slavery in
Okay.
the British Empire
Fair enough. Yeah.
is big, because now suddenly the British authorities are saying, no, sorry, no more slaves.
Yeah.
They offered to pay the farmers compensation, but the Dutch farmers are pissed off
Yeah.
because, hey, they're going to get a couple of £1,000 or something per,
The Dutch. It's an aside, but the
was
Dutch.
actually relatively generous. But as you know from American history, a slave is worth more in perpetuity because his children will become
Yeah.
your possessions as well.
It's kind of
What
an
were you gonna say,
aside.
Adam?
Oh, it's an aside, but the Dutch colony of, they called it Dutch Guinea. Now it's Suriname. They were
Oh, right.
they were famously cruel.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's strange, isn't it, when you think of Holland as being one of the enlightened
Yeah,
countries
it's a
of
happy
Europe.
place. It's hard. You
And,
don't want to think about it.
Much more
But they're
tolerant.
conservative people, even in You know,
Oh God, yes.
in Holland, even you have your conservative,
Right.
and then you have that very liberal.
Right.
Yes.
Well, and just the dynamic of a frontier, extractive,
Right.
colonial society.
Yes,
You can't.
That underpins
Right.
everything we're
Yes.
saying.
Every
Right.
single thing.
No, totally. of
It's the
course.
poison
Yeah.
coursing through its veins
Absolutely.
in every
Yeah.
interaction.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, there was an issue at a place called Slachter's Neck, and what the British magistrate, or whoever he was, did,
Slachter is like a butcher.
Butcher's
Okay.
Neck.
Oh,
yes, it's an
slaughter.
ominous
Slaughter.
name, yeah.
Mm.
And he sent this company of soldiers who were actually Hottentot soldiers. In other words,
Oh,
black
geez.
soldiers.
Yeah. Oh
With
boy.
a British, with a white officer,
Here it
to
is.
arrest this Dutch farmer
Oh,
who had
boy.
apparently beaten a slave to death or something. He'd done something that they deemed inappropriate.
Yeah.
And that caused a huge ripple of resentment. It
Oh, boy.
basically brought it to boiling point.
Yeah.
And we had something called the Great Trek
A great
coming
Trek.
out of that, where the Dutch farmer said, right, we're fed up with this British administration.
What is it?
We're going to load our ox wagons. They were like the equivalent of these guys today who have the "Don't Tread on Me."
Yeah.
Like I'm gonna do. How Dutch sons inherited their farms, apparently, was you rode for a whole day out on horseback, and the perimeter that you could ride became the next farm in the family.
God damn.
So you kind of
That was your
expanded
boundary.
further and further, and your resilience as to how far you could ride in a day
How
and
fast a horse you had.
how fast a horse, etc., you could claim that land, right? The
Ah.
ideal being that you couldn't see your father's house anymore,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You would be over the next couple of hills. So they
Free- yeah.
trekked into, and that's where the Transvaal and the Orange Free
Right.
State came from, right?
But it
And that was called the Boer.
the
what's
Great
the,
Trek.
It's
the
the
gr-
great
it's called
trek.
the
What's the
Great
Dutch
Trek.
name for it? The Boer name.
No, it's
Boer
just the
Trek.
foot- the
Yeah,
foot
the
trek.
Oh,
trek
I thought
is
there
a
was-
Dutch
Yeah.
word, right?
Oh,
the
okay.
foot trekkers. What
Okay.
they call a foot
The foot
trekkers.
trekkers,
Yeah.
right.
So they
Yeah.
have these Dutch, these ox wagons. They're
Yeah.
pulled by oxen.
It's
But
famous. It's iconic.
Right,
The
right,
imagery
right,
is.
right. The-
Totally.
yeah,
unmistakable.
For
absolutely.
them was
Is that-
absolutely sacred.
It's like crossing the American West.
That's
yes.
correct.
The Oregon
Covered
wagon.
Trail,
Right.
Yeah.
all that. It's the
Okay.
Except
same-
it's done out of this absolute resentment of the British administration.
Right.
And the British administration, the Dutch want to get beyond the
Right.
boundary of the administration,
Right.
so they want to go outside the territory of
We're
Yeah,
the.
if
forging
we-
a new
if-
nation.
If
Right,
you're going to tell
new
us what to
nation.
do, we're going to move so far away
Yeah.
that you're not going to be able to.
out of your jurisdiction.
What
Right.
year? What year was this?
When was it? 1835.
1836.
Right.
No, I think it was 1835.
Shortly after the emancipation
Okay.
of slaves.
Wow.
Right.
Okay.
And
But
what,
they, of course, had to encounter then more Bantu people
Yeah.
who were already there.
What are you doing here?
Yeah, the Zulus, the Matabele, who were formidable military. The Matabele were really an offshoot of the Zulu nation.
Oh,
So
okay.
they were formidable warriors.
Mm.
And there were a couple of huge battles,
Mm.
similar to your Native American,
Ah.
European wars.
Sure.
Right? The same kind of pattern.
They were forcing them to coalesce and fight for their own
Yeah,
land.
pretty much.
Yeah,
Or drive
yeah.
them out
Yeah.
in one way.
It's
or
a
the
fight
other.
for survival.
Basically, pretty
Oof.
much,
Yeah.
yeah. And the Europeans had gunpowder,
Yeah.
and they had a more efficient way of organizing themselves
Yes.
because of culturally they were capable of doing that. You can
but
tell.
also you have to understand that it wasn't all the Dutch that left,
Right.
right? A
Yeah,
lot, it
no,
was
some of them
it was actually
stayed.
a minority of them.
They were
Um,
the hardcore.
They
Right.
were really the hardcore.
Hardcore
And-
right wing.
Right,
Right wing,
right.
that's
yeah,
exactly
today
right.
we'd call them
And
that.
so what
Yeah.
you had, as South
Conservative.
Africa developed, you had the much more conservative, hardline Afrikaner in the Transvaal, in the Free State, whereas in the Cape Colony,
Right.
the ones who stayed behind were much more influenced by sort of more liberal British
Right.
type.
They were fine with emancipation.
Yeah,
They were okay with
they-
emancipation,
they-
and
they-
the deal was, of course, they could trade the British had brought economic prosperity in many ways, right?
Right.
Because they'd opened up this arteries of the empire
Right.
to these Dutch farmers.
As
They could-
opposed to grubbing a
Yeah.
living off the
Yeah,
land,
how
inland
else do you
Africa.
sell your,
Right.
you revittle the ships, you
Oh,
sell your
yeah.
produce in Cape Town,
Yeah.
you organize in such a way. It's a little bit like that Monty Python thing. Remember in Life of Brian, where what have the Romans ever
Yeah.
done for us?
What have the
right?
British done for us?
Right, you know, they did build roads, and
Yeah.
there is law and order now, and you know, we can
Prosperity, wine,
actually,
baths,
right, there's a
sewer
stock
system.
exchange, and I can invest my money in the bank and
Yeah.
send my kid to school. But of course, you didn't have higher education institutions; were all in English, right?
Right. Yeah.
The British didn't
Yeah.
set up Dutch-speaking.
That was another
universities.
huge
Yeah.
point of contention with the Dutch is this
They felt threatened.
system of
Yeah.
Anglicization,
Yeah.
where they
Yes.
were told in the Cape Colony that they had to do all their administrative stuff in English.
Right.
And that's another reason why they buggered off up the.
And the English, in their inimitable way, was sort of condescending
and
and arrogant
condescending
and
and-
snobby towards them.
There's a strange thread of like following in the English speaking history, that historical thread of causing really bad social outcomes that are by following legal technicalities instead of being just kind of more pragmatic. Most notably, kind of the American Revolution, in a way of like, just let the local aristocrats, people like Thomas Jefferson and George
yeah.
Washington, collect the tax.
Yeah.
But they went, no, we want our administrators to do it.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
It's not actually too dissimilar, although what's always baffled me a little bit is historically both the Dutch and the English culture has a deep pragmatic streak to it, right?
Yeah.
So it's rather weird, because in many ways there were many affinities between the two white cultures, and yet at the same time, of course, they chose to squabble over essentially relatively petty issues.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's anyway. Lord Charles Somerset is who.
Somerset,
He
yeah.
was the one who
Yeah.
wanted to try and.
And he was
Anglicize.
German, actually.
Yeah. Hold
He
your
wants
mic a bit
Oh,
closer.
no, that was Milner.
Milner was German.
Milner.
Yeah.
Hold your mic a bit closer, Peter.
Sorry. Somerset wanted to anglicize the schools and stuff, right? He figured we've got these subjects. They're basically white people. White people are more important than black people.
Right.
So we need to turn them into loyal little subjects of empire.
Right.
It wasn't totally unsuccessful, of course. He did succeed in doing that to some degree. But he was an autocrat
In the Cape.
in the Cape.
Wasn't it
He was-
Milner who did
No,
the
no, there was
Anglicias?
earlier.
whatever?
Somerset was governor of the Cape Colony.
I know, but who did the policy of Anglicization?
It was,
I thought that
well,
was
it was
Milner.
Somerset. No, that came later, dear.
Okay.
Oh. But, you know, what's interesting is that some of the English settlers resisted Somerset, and there a man called Pringle established freedom of the press.
Oh.
And he fought very hard against Lord Charles Somerset and the other British administrators to establish freedom of the press in the colony. And of course, that's a legacy that South Africa still has to this very day, right? We have a very active, very critical, and all through the apartheid era,
Yeah.
the newspapers gave the apartheid government shit all the time.
Huh.
They were always
The English language newspaper.
the English papers anyway. Yeah.
Yeah.
There they were, and a lot of the editors got deported, or they got under house arrest, or
What's that movie?
they went through various harassments.
the East London guy. What's the movie again?
Oh,
The
right,
Biko.
Cry Freedom.
Cry Freedom.
About Steve Biko.
But Donald
yeah,
Woods was
it's
the
about
editor.
Donald Woods, who was the
Oh.
editor
Of the
of
Port
the English
Elizabeth
newspaper in
newspaper,
East
yeah.
London,
Huh.
and he was put under house arrest, etc.
So that's quite interesting that actually
Yeah.
arose under resistance to the British administration, right?
That is strange.
Pringle might have, I think he was a Scotsman, typical of the bloody Scots, of course.
I
you
think
know,
he came in with the
causing
settlers.
trouble.
He came in with the 1820 settlers.
Right. You said
Pringle.
the Pringle family was
Yes,
important.
Grahamstown.
So how does this lead to the Boer War? Is it the discovery of gold?
Yes.
and,
Well, what happens is when the Boers leave, they travel north. They actually interested in finding a port because, of course, if you're going to set
Oh.
up
But
your own,
once they found their promised land, they
Yes,
needed the
but,
promised land first.
but they're going up north, and they want to go east. But to find a port. But what the British did at that point was they went up by sea. They went up the coast, and they actually
They
took
stole-
over Natal.
They stole a
Right.
march.
Yeah,
Yes,
right.
yes, basically.
Right.
No
Yes.
way.
So,
Yes.
so
That's
blocked.
amazing.
So
It's exactly
the poor
what
old
happened.
boers have been dragging their ox wagons over rocks and over
yeah.
the
Rivers,
entire
mountains,
Drakensberg.
The Drakensberg, the Orange River.
Yeah.
They come
No,
down
yeah.
from the mountains.
And the Brits are
with
there.
Huge
Yeah.
labor.
Ah.
Get to the coast, and what do they find but the Union Jack flying
Unbelievable.
happily in
Yeah.
the trading
And is
posts.
this Port Elizabeth?
Natal,
No, this is
Durban.
Natal. This is Durban,
Durban.
area.
and
Okay, so this
various
is farther
ports.
north.
Further
East.
north,
Okay,
yeah. I
okay,
mean, they've
Durban.
gone a long way. They were
Oh, yeah.
dying, and they also squabble. The Dutch on this journey, they squabble amongst themselves, right? As
Of
is
course.
inevitable.
That's what people
So
do.
one
Yeah,
branch
absolutely.
goes down looking for a port,
Okay.
doesn't find it, and they settle what they eventually settle for the Orange Free
Orange
State.
Free State. Okay, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other branch that is fighting with the guy from the Orange Free State, and I can't remember which was which.
Oh, there were a whole bunch.
There's
of
going to be
They-
a lot of names.
Right.
doesn't matter,
They continue going north,
Okay.
and they claim what they called the Transvaal. The
Transvaal.
Vaal means it was a name of a river,
Okay.
and Vaal means grey, so it just means the grey river. Cross trans
It's got a lot of
across
silt
the
in
grey
the water.
the grey
Okay.
river, and that's where Johannesburg, and that's
Okay.
where the gold mines, etc.
Right.
But of course, in the Free State, on the very west, that's where, along the boundary of the Orange River, and that's where the diamonds.
Ah. Okay.
Diamonds come first
They come
Okay.
in the
first.
mineral discoveries.
Okay.
Right.
Right.
Diamonds, then
They
gold.
cause a they cause
They
a
cause
rush.
all kinds of
They
crap.
cause
Real
a
rush.
diamond rush.
And is this a worldwide diamond right? Like
Pretty
everybody,
much.
a who's
Yep.
who? Is,
Yep.
Okay.
Irish, Americans,
Oh.
riff-raff from all over the bloody
So this
place.
is
who'd been tromping
1840s,
around.
1850s?
About 1850s,
50s,
1860s,
yeah.
I think
Okay,
you're
okay.
talking. Yeah.
Okay.
And the British, the Dutch tried to claim, it's sort of our territory on the Orange River, and the
Okay.
British say, no, this is part of the Cape Colony. It's our territory.
Ah, yeah.
So
Really, it was just indeterminate,
yeah.
semi-desert scrub, most of it.
Okay.
But who held the whip hand would control the
Yeah.
diamond fields. And
Yeah.
that's where Cecil Rhodes, of course, gets his start,
Right.
right? Rhodes comes out from England because he sniffs wealth as a young man, and he sets up in the diamond fields, and he starts to buy up the various other guys.
Right.
Because some of very analogous to the Black Hills or
Oh, yeah.
Klondike or whatever.
That's the story of Montana.
Yeah, a
Right.
whole bunch of guys.
It's not the
all
guys
Seek-
digging the
seek-
diamonds out. It's the
Right.
secondary
Yeah.
players above.
There you
how
go,
they
yeah.
organize, and you buy out a fellow. who
Marcus
can't
Clark
make
was a
it.
grocer. He
Right.
made his money selling groceries to gold miners.
There you go.
Yeah.
Very
I'm not going to
sens-
bother digging fucking gold.
Right, there
Yeah.
you go.
You're
Ab-
the moron. You're going to
absolute-
pay me with the gold.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's exactly the story. And you know about the big hole and
Yeah.
stuff, right? They
Oh, Butte, Montana. Oh,
end up excavating a huge cavernous.
it's what it is. It's a
thing.
plague of locusts.
Pretty much.
And the people who really went out are the ones who
Yes.
eat the locusts.
Yes.
Not even the. It's Marcus Daly. Sorry, William Clark. Yeah, but
And they
Copper
were-
Kings.
and
Copper
they were
Kings.
racists.
Oh.
So but they had to use black people, of course, to do
All the damn labor
a lot of the
digging.
donkey work,
Yeah.
digging the crap out
Yeah.
and stuff. So that's what happens.
Huh.
And Rhodes is a cunning bastard,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
Oh yeah.
Because he actually befriends the African workers
Right.
and he treats them quite nicely. Being an Englishman and
At
being a little
first.
different from the average white settler.
His
he
hand
has-
doesn't have to wield the whip. He has to just tell the whip.
Yeah, he's
Yeah.
he's
He can be a
actually-
step removed.
Yeah, he's actually quite pleasant to them, and
Yeah.
he treats them like human beings.
Yeah.
So he wins them over, and he gets the support of the black miners, which is quite interesting because later on, when he becomes Prime Minister of the Cape Colony and he's in power, he passes legislation that treats the black people like shit. So, I mean, he's a total hypocrite, but
Oh, yeah.
there you are.
Yeah.
But that's how he got an in
Huh.
originally. And then he starts buying up the other guys. As you accrue more wealth, you can, some guys got fed up with it.
Oh,
and
yeah.
he wants to go home or he wants to sell out. And so,
Yeah.
so by the time of the gold discovery, Rhodes was already a rich man.
Huh.
He'd already
Interesting.
established himself as quite a powerful figure in the white settler culture.
Yeah.
And then,
But all this time, you've got the blacks who are leaving their homeland, if you like, their regions where
Right.
their wives and their kids, and they're going to places like these mines and other to work for whites.
Right.
And so you've already got the migration and the breakup of African homes,
Right.
and domestic groups and so on.
Right.
So
And this is still before
before-
Shaka and
no,
those-
Shaka's already come
so
and
that
gone.
kingdom's
That's on the
established.
Yeah.
east side, and that's when
Okay,
that's in the Natal region, when Britain takes over Natal, they start clashing with the
That's-
Zulus, and
okay.
that's the
Those are those battles.
Yes,
That's
that's
the friction
That's the
point
way
there.
of-
Yes.
Right.
How do you pronounce his name?
Who?
Quetzalcoatl.
Quetzalcoatl.
Quetzalcoatl was
Yeah.
the
S-
king
17
after Shaka.
17
Who
Rorke's
finally
Rorke's
gets
Drift
clashed.
and-
Right.
That's when all that happens.
Yes,
yes.
1779, I
Oh,
think is
okay. I'm
Quetzalcoatl.
way off then. Dang.
And that's a whole
My-
interesting.
oh boy. My
No, it's
timeline.
just
No,
that
no,
so much
you-
is
it's-
happening
it's
at,
Oh, God,
at,
Yeah.
at
No,
the
no,
same
you're,
time.
you're on the money. It's
Right.
just that it took the white settlement in Natal quite a long time
Right.
to expand.
Okay.
And what's very interesting as a sub-story to the Zulu thing was that there was a fairly defined frontier between Zululand and the Natal
Okay.
English colony
Okay.
to the south.
Okay.
And for a long time, that was kind of the status quo, right? The English settlers didn't want to mess with the Zulus. They
Okay.
were a
They
powerful,
were too
Yeah,
scary.
after
Jesus
Chaka,
Christ.
they were still a very powerful military force. But what starts to happen is particularly the missionaries begin to have an influence.
Oh, okay.
And the African people who've moved more or less for labor purposes into the English colony
Mm.
and started to work on the farms and go to the mission schools, they start to develop a cultural change, a cultural schism.
Right. Okay.
What brought about the clash was often girls or young women running away from their appointed husband, because in
Ah.
the tribal culture
Yeah.
you were told you were going to marry Charlie,
Yeah.
and that was it. There was no
Charlie was
question.
usually an old
He was
geezer.
an old geezer, about
Ah, yeah, it
33 or
sucks.
something.
Yeah.
And of course, they got rumors spread that if you crossed the river and went to one of these missionary places,
Ah.
they
yeah.
would give you refuge from this,
Yeah.
The British authorities are like, shit, we don't really like having these missionaries there because they're upsetting the native people,
Yeah.
right? They're giving them Christian ideas
That's
and
always
changing their-
explosive.
dressing them in cotton shorts and brassieres and not quite, but you get the
Right.
idea.
No. No. Yeah.
Whereas a lot of the British imperial policy was a kind of leave the natives alone
Yeah.
if they're not bothering you.
Yeah.
Let the chiefs
Yeah.
become sort of like puppets, but essentially still have their own religion and customs and culture. If you study like Nigeria, that's how the British ran what you call an administrative colony. You probably don't remember this, but when we did post-colonial literature, I emphasized the difference between a settler colonialism and administrative
Oh, yeah.
colonialism.
Yeah.
And Natal was essentially settler colonialism.
Okay.
So you couldn't do both. One way or the other, something had to give.
Yeah.
And eventually it reaches a boiling point.
Yeah. It's one thing to have a guy who's an advisor to a king,
Oh, right.
than to have settlers taking
Oh.
land from.
Land is huge.
That's it. That's wealth.
Of course. Yeah. And quite rightly, the Zulus were threatened one way or the other,
Yeah.
But again, gunpowder versus spears,
Yeah.
assegais, it's
Assegai.
not fair, is it?
Yeah. But still, they kicked ass.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah. Oh,
the
yeah.
story of Rourke's Drift.
Oh, sure.
And
They're
they
like
do
up.
get- They
And
do get
Isandlwana
guns.
before Rourke's
Yeah.
Drift, they wiped out a whole battalion of
But the
guys,
story was like the scouting party of the British like crested a hill, and there's like 30,000 Zulu
Yeah.
warriors
Whoa.
sitting in absolute silence.
Right. Ouch. Yeah.
I can't imagine what that would look like.
It
And of
The,
reminds
course-
me,
the discipline.
it's a little
Yeah.
like the Spartans.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
dealing with
That's not a.
you're
yeah.
dealing with the
And
Spartan
of course, they
culture.
were
Yeah.
they were. I mean, he had conquered because the Zulus were actually a small group at first, a
Yeah.
fairly small clan.
like
Yeah.
the Latins.
That and the Shaka had gathered all these
The
others
gatherer.
and dominated
Yeah.
and really managed to push them into a very fine force, disciplined force that worked together
There's
so well.
so much symmetry
Yeah.
between the stages of imperial rise, plateau, decline.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
it's like the story of Genghis Khan is very similar to Modu Chanyu,
Yes.
to the
yes.
location, place, social structure. It's like
Totally.
you have to tread the same path
Yeah.
as your time and your ancestors. And here we are.
Yeah.
Well, we're only human and we're
Yeah.
funny little anthropoid creatures. What's so interesting to frame the whole southern African history, of course, is it's the cradle of humankind in the first
Yeah,
place,
right.
right?
Hottentots and
we
San
all
people
came
are
from the same bloody place. at
all
the
of our
beginning.
ancestors had cliques.
Isn't that incredible?
language.
Yeah. And funny little brown people
Yeah.
that today we wouldn't look twice at, right? I
Who
mean,
are just
Yeah.
superbly sophisticated at surviving in their environment. It's
Absolutely.
unbelievable.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
They look at a desert and they see a grocery
Yeah.
store.
Right.
I wish you.
Yeah.
You know,
It's
they're, oh
incredible.
yeah, here I go.
Yeah.
Let's
It's
Let's eat.
incredible.
I
Yeah.
listened to this one thing of a guy. It was just a little YouTube video about demonstration of click languages, and they're asking some San guy about the local grass,
Yes.
and it's amazing to listen to because it's kind of a cognitively like I don't know what I'm listening to, but it's amazing.
Yes.
All the his language. For him, it was probably utterly trivial because he's like, well, we can use it for a pillow, or we can use it as a mat to sleep on, or to make rope, or whatever. And for him, it's like asking us, what do you use a spoon for? Or what can I, do you ever use wood? I suppose I do. But yeah,
When I can
it's-
find it, right?
Yeah.
It's relatively rare where I live.
Yeah.
No, it's amazing. And the Bushmen, so-called the San
The
people
San.
now,
Yeah.
were painting rock paintings
Oh,
300 years ago that in many ways are very similar to Cro-Magnon man in Europe and
Yeah.
in 35,000 years ago
Yeah.
in the caves of southern
Lascaux, yeah.
in Spain and Altamira. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
incredible. But anyway, so that's
yeah. Okay.
oh, you're thinking about okay.
So now we have the Orange Free State, the Natal Republic.
The names are
Gold
quite
Rush,
interesting, Adam.
yeah.
Of those in those
Oh,
colonies,
okay.
Bethlehem,
Ah.
Bethel,
Oh,
New Canaan, Canaan.
God damn it!
Coming
Yeah.
straight out of the Old Testament
course.
Bible,
Natal.
they were discovering their
Yeah.
new promised land. Right, that was the mythology that the Boers, the trekkers cultivated.
This reminds me of the Mormons.
But it's very similar.
Yeah.
But they couldn't be left alone because, hey presto, suddenly El Dorado is right there
Yeah.
in the middle of their little rural idyllic paradise, right?
Yep.
And so they have to start dealing with the pesky outsiders coming in. And of course they came in their droves. If you
Yeah.
think Kimberley was big, then
Yeah.
the Witwatersrand was huge by comparison.
Gold was what, 1885?
Somewhere
Around
the
there,
little,
somewhere around there.
18
Little
Okay.
started with
1876, I think the
79.
first
Okay.
surface gold was discovered, like
So-
nuggets and stuff.
Okay.
But then very quickly And of course, in order to exploit it,
Yeah.
it was deep mining.
Reef.
You had to bring capitalism in. You had to bring big money. You had
Engineers,
you had to raise
Germans,
money. You
Americans,
you had to have
British,
yeah, technological.
all came in
Right.
droves.
Right.
And remember that the Transvaal, which is there's the Free State, and then the second group of Boers formed the Transvaal. They
Okay.
declared the Transvaal independent.
Right.
Both the Orange Free State and the Transvaal declared independence, right? Independent of Britain.
Right. Okay.
And when gold was discovered, it was Paul Kruger. You've heard the Kruger Rands, right? There you go. He tried to keep the Uitlanders, as he called them, the outsiders, at bay.
He was the prime
He was
minister.
the president of
The
the
Transvaal
Transvaal.
Republic. Yeah.
Okay.
of the Transvaal Republic, yeah. And I mean, it was just it's kind of tragic when you
Sordid.
see what they went through, because they were just dirt farmers. I mean, that is not good farming land,
Okay.
and that's what they were doing before gold.
Yeah.
They were really a kind of a scrub, using the Africans to help them.
Is it even? Do you have to irrigate, or can you? Is it marginal rain?
It's marginal
Very
rain
marginal
mostly, but
rain.
Very
in
marginal.
some areas you absolutely have to. Without irrigation, you
Yeah.
couldn't farm.
Yeah.
As you get over to the western side of the Transvaal, it's more and more like the Kalahari.
It blends into
It's
the
turning
Kalahari.
it's
right?
turning into semi-desert,
Yeah.
scrubland. Actually, the texture of the landscape, New Mexico reminded me very
Ah.
much
Ah.
in terms of the dryness of the soil, the red sandy
Ah,
ground, the scrubby bush trees,
sure.
the thorn felt, we call it, the bush felt.
Right.
It's not totally infertile, and if you can bring water to it,
Right.
you can actually produce crops. But remember when we took Willem to that farmer in Illinois,
Yes,
he produced something like, what was it, 8 bushels an acre?
I don't know. He was,
And the Illinois guy produced about 110 or something.
Yeah.
I mean, relatively speaking.
Right.
There was no comparison.
Right. Huh. So now the tension is building. There's.
and we gonna-
Do you want some sardines for the guy?
Can we?
Yeah, we can pause. We can pause and
Can
do it
we
again. This is a
pause?
good
Yeah.
spot. Let
Yeah.
me do a coda. So there's a lot of wealth now. There's also a lot of
Competition.
competition, and there's an imbalance of power. You have dirt farmers trying to defend a lot of wealth against the British
Yes.
Empire.
Right.
Yes.
So the stage is set.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very
and,
much so.
And, that,
All right. So
and you've got all these Africans who are being
Right.
brought in
exploited.
to go down those mines and
Miles
to do
deep.
the dirty work and to lose their lives and leave their families behind.
Yeah.
It's the industrial
Yeah.
introduction of industry really in a big way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So that's part 1. Ending now.